Hi, my name is Rabbi Margie Klein-Ronkin, and welcome to RUACH, which stands for Religious Understanding and Community Harmony, and is also the Hebrew word meaning spirit or breath of God. This is a time when clergy from around the Lynn area get to talk about important issues of our lives and our times. And today we're going to be talking about myth and meaning as we are in the holiday season and there are lots of stories to make meaning of. So this is a smaller show than usual, so I will let my colleague introduce himself and then we'll get started.
Hi, I'm John Nicketh. I'm the pastor at First Lutheran Church in Lynn and Wyama Square, and it's a pleasure to be with you today, Margie, just the two of us. It's a busy time of year, and
Yes.
some of our other colleagues are caught up in the hustle and bustle of the season.
Yes, which it is easy to be. So we're missing Father Brian and Reverend Andre, who couldn't be here today, but in general are here. And we're also missing Reverend Jean, who was the pastor for many, many years at St. Stephen's and has moved on to California. So we wish her all the blessings and all of the good luck in that experience.
Yes, we had actually recorded a little farewell to her last month, and due to some technical issues, it didn't get broadcast. So Jane, if you're watching us from sunny California, know that we love you and miss you. And when we think of meaning, especially this time of year, we think of you and the many gifts that you gave us, both as individuals and to our Lynn community. So Advent and Christmas blessings to you.
Amen. So, John, when you're thinking about myth and Christmas and the holidays, like what comes up for you? I mean, how did you grow up hearing the Christmas story or the stories of Santa?
Mm-hmm. Well, so that's a good way to come at this question of myth, because when we hear the word myth, at least in 21st century Western culture, we think of something that's made up.
Like myth and fact.
Right, myth versus fact. So we learned about Greek mythology, and myth sort of has almost, in some religious circles, can have a negative connotation. If something's a myth and it's not true, it's not real, it's fantasy. And I think, hopefully there's no children watching, but Santa Claus sometimes fell into that. You're brought up being told this story that this burly old guy with a beard comes down the chimney and leaves presents under the tree, and then someday you grow up and realize, oh, that was all made up. It was just a nice story. And some people get very cynical at that point, think, well, that was a lie. And then all these other stories that I've been brought up to find meaning in are also lies, and I have no use for the whole thing. Santa Claus is perhaps a topic for a whole other show, whether it's good to tell our children things that aren't actually true. But so Santa aside, I can always remember Christmas being a very special time of year because of baby Jesus. As a child, I don't think I grasped the whole story and how that story was part of the larger narrative of who Jesus was and what the Christian people are supposed to be in the world, but that there was this miraculous birth where there were angels and shepherds, and that there was the part I remember my mother talking about was how there was no room in the inn, and so that Jesus had to be born with the animals in this stable, and that story was very precious and retold every year at Christmas time, and how that related to the gift giving and all the other stuff wasn't probably clear at the time, but I sort of remember the gist of it. It wasn't until much later that the sort of the depth of meaning that is embedded in that story became real for me, and how I sort of separated out a lot of the parts that are perhaps the most widely known or the most celebrated in some of the songs we sing or in the traditions versus the what we might call the radical meaning underneath all of that. So the story has, I guess, grown and evolved with me as I've grown myself. How about you? And certainly not Christmas, but...
Yeah, well, so it's interesting. At this time of year, Hanukkah is so much like there's Christians have Christmas and Jews have Hanukkah. But Hanukkah is really not a major holiday. Like, if it weren't for the fact, like in Muslim countries where Jews live, like, Hanukkah was not a big deal at all. The reason it's a big deal is because we live in a predominantly Christian country and everyone's celebrating Christmas. So the Jewish kids, you know, want something too. And Hanukkah is an interesting story in terms of myth and meaning because it's not so clear what the holiday is about. Like, the rabbis of the Talmud are like, what is this holiday called Hanukkah? And it's a holiday about purist Jews who were fighting assimilationists in a time when the Syrian Greeks were occupying Jerusalem. And they fought off the Greeks, and they were able to preserve the temple. They rededicated the temple. But the ironic thing about it is they created a dedication ceremony and a holiday for a military victory, which is a Greek practice. So the people who were like, we hate everything about Greeks, took on Greek names and made a Greek-like holiday. So, and were very militant. And once they got to be in charge, they were in charge for 100 years. They were terrible rulers. And then someone else took over. So the fact that this is the story is kind of weird. So then the rabbis, a couple hundred years later, told the story of the miracle of the light. That when this dedication was happening, there wasn't enough oil, and there's only enough oil for one day, and it lasted for 8 days. And throughout history, depending on what's been going on, different parts of the story have been emphasized. Sometimes, like around the founding of the State of Israel, when it was like, we have to fight for our freedom, everyone wanted to tell the military version about Judah Maccabee fighting the oppressors. And then at other times, when we wanted to think more about peace, we de-emphasized that part of the story and focused on the miracle of light. And at a certain point, as I was growing up, I started wondering, well, why is it that this miracle of light wasn't in the original story that was written down? Like, doesn't that seem like the most important part of the story? Why would it only be written down many years later? So one option is, well, it really happened, it was passed through the tradition, and then it got written down by the rabbis. Another version is that the rabbis made it up as a distraction because the time that the rabbis are writing was right after a major revolt that led all of the Jews to be kicked out of the land of Israel, and Israel was razed by the Romans, and you know, the earth was salted and scorched, and so it was like, do not revolt, that is bad for our people. So let's have this distraction tactic. So then the question is, well, if it maybe, how are we supposed to know if it happened? Like, the fact that it's written somewhere, does that mean that it happened? I don't know. I don't know those people. So if I'm not 100% sure that it happened, what's the point of it? Is it still worth it? So for me, I feel like it's a beautiful story. And the story helps frame who I am and how I look at the world. That I'm the kind of person that descended from people that believed in a story about taking a risk and lighting one candle and hoping it would last. Whether or not the original part of that story was 100% factual, there's no way I can know. But there's something about that story that has to do with my people and who I am, and so it feels really holy to carry it on, even if I'm not sure of the details. I don't know about you. How do you deal with factual?
Well, I love
not?
Just what you said there, how it's a living tradition, right?
Yeah.
The first story doesn't have reference to this, but then it finds its way in. And rather than seeing that as something to discredit the holiday, but that, of course, traditions always evolve. Stories are retold and adapted for our particular time and place, and how lovely that in this story, different pieces have been useful at different times, and that it's a broad enough story to encompass times where there were persecution and times where there were peace. The same, I think, is true in the story of the Nativity. The Christmas is, theologically speaking, about the incarnation or the birth of God in the form of this human being, Jesus Christ. So the important thing of the story are not the details of the story, how many angels were in the sky, or what time of day it happened, or whether it was in an actual manger, or whether it was in a house that had an area for animals, or whether that is all made up, because all those details are, you know, those are recorded in one gospel and not the others. The Gospel of Mark, actually, which is probably the first written, has no account of the incarnation whatsoever. It starts with Jesus' baptism. And for Eastern Christians, the Eastern Orthodox, Jesus' baptism is a more significant holiday than Christmas. So the important thing is not the story of his birth, but when he was sort of anointed for his mission as Messiah to save the people and to, you know, quoting from Isaiah, to lift up the oppressed, recovery of sight to the blind, the year of the Lord's favor, all that stuff. So for me, the significance of the story is that God came to be with us. That however you want to think about what happened on the actual day or didn't happen, however you want to conceive of how the conception happened, you know, in the tradition, Mary is a virgin who was Jesus was conceived by the Holy Spirit, and Joseph was sort of like a stepfather who raised him. However you want to think about the biology of it is less important to me than the idea that God is not this, or not only this far-off figure who is sort of unapproachable to us ordinary folks, but one who comes to share our human life, who understands what it's like to be human, because God wears our flesh and blood. God suffers alongside of us, works for justice alongside of us, and therefore God is this very very approachable, accessible figure. That's the beauty of the Christmas story for me. Interestingly enough, I think in the story itself, there's also ways of looking at it as a very sort of soothing, comforting story, and it's a very world-changing story. I mean, the story you hear on Christmas Eve is of the angels and the shepherds, and glory to God in the highest, and you have this warm feeling at church with the candles, and it's, of course, people need, especially this time of year, to find solace and comfort. There's so much screwed up in the world right now. We want to know that we belong to this larger, overarching story, that things are going to be okay. But also, we can't forget that when the angel told Mary that she was going to bear Jesus, Mary, of course, being a teenage peasant girl who suddenly finds herself pregnant in a society where unmarried teenage mothers are sort of, it's frowned upon, even more so than maybe today, is chosen to be the mother of God. That alone is a pretty radical statement, that God chooses not some queen or princess or wealthy maiden to be the mother of Christ, but this unknown girl. But also, when she hears that message, she responds with this song we call the Magnificat, where she says, "My soul proclaims the greatness of the Lord, for he has looked upon the lowliness of his servant. He has cast down the mighty from their thrones. He has lifted up the lowly. He has filled the hungry with good things and sent the rich away empty." And it's this song, if you take it seriously, that it's about upsetting the whole world order. That this child who's going to be born is not just for warm fuzzies and for a good feeling at Christmas time, but it's going to really upset the power structure of the whole universe. And that she is a vessel through which this is going to happen. So the story has this very social justice, major political implications angle to it as well.
Yeah, I think something that I'm hearing from how you're saying it is that part of, like, a myth is a story, but it's not just any story. It's a story from which we make meaning. And it's a story that that forms who we are, and it's communicating something. So the way that you were just able to tell, and you could take different meanings from it, but the way that you're telling the Christmas story, like, as a Jewish person, you know, I don't connect with the part that's, you know, like, maybe we're all children of God, but that God is specifically, you know, only or particularly in Jesus. But the meaning that you're making out of it, I'm like, yeah, I totally get behind that. And it's interesting how like different cultures can have different myths or different stories that might actually sort of get us to the same values or the same point. I'm thinking about, there's a variety of American myths like I cannot tell a lie, and Johnny Appleseed. Like who knows whether any of them happen, but they have to do with like how we understand who we are. I think for Jews, the core story is the story of the Exodus. There's a family story of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and then they go down to Egypt, and the family's enslaved, and then with help of Moses and God, they go forth in this miraculous way and march towards the promised land. And so much of our liturgy and our year cycle is all about that journey. And when I was in rabbinical school, we started reading these texts that said, like, archaeological evidence says we don't know if the Exodus really happened. We don't know if the Israelites were actually slaves in Egypt. Maybe a few of them, but maybe there were some people that were already in Canaan, in the land of Israel, and some people that went forth. And that's the reason that there are certain discrepancies in the text. And when I was first reading this, I was like, what? Like, how do all my professors know this? And yet we're still like doing this? What's happening? And one idea that people talked about is called second naivete. So being naive is like, like you really don't know anything, or you're acting like you don't know anything. Second naivete is like you don't know anything, then you learn something, but then you assume some of the innocence and the openness that comes from not knowing is really beautiful and like really opens up your own heart. So the idea with second naivete is to say like, okay, I don't know. I'm not an archaeologist, and I wasn't there in that time. I don't want to profess just blind faith. Like I don't know what exactly happened, but I believe that there was some collective experience of liberation that people are told their children about and are passing down from generation to generation. And as I said, or as you put it in better words before, like that sense of a living tradition that in every generation we're supposed to feel like we went forth from the land of Egypt. And so whether or not, or however that story happened originally, I feel like I've lived that story so much. I've probably said this before, but when I was 10, Nelson Mandela was, have I told you this already?
No, I don't.
Okay, so Nelson Mandela was like released from prison and apartheid ended. And there was this big parade in New York, like a ticker tape parade through New York City. And there was some controversy about whether Jews would march or not. And so a bunch of Jews in my family marched, and I held up a sign that said, Jews against apartheid. And then CBS National News came and asked the principal of my Jewish day school, like, who should we talk to? So they knew I talked a lot, so they sent me. I wound up on the CBS News, and the anchor says, okay, who are you? And like, why do you have this sign that says Jews against apartheid? And so I, at age 10, said, I was a slave in the land of Egypt, and
great.
I have gone forth with God's help. And so now I have to fight for people who are enslaved in every era and in my own generation. And afterwards, my parents were like, honey, like you live in Manhattan on the Upper West Side. Like you're not a slave at all. But I had so much internalized that story, and it was so much about who I am. I had so much meaning of that story that who I was and how I was going to relate to other people had to do with the origin story of who our people are and what kind of empathy that demanded of me, so that as a 10-year-old, I literally thought that I had been a slave. Like I sort of had it in my, like I wasn't a slave in my own life, but we were slaves, so I pictured that. And I think that there's a certain amount of chutzpah, or of, I don't know, it's like a little rude to say I was a slave when there are people that like really have dealt with the horrors of slavery, and like I have not at all. But how cool that a story could shape who we are in that kind of way. And I'm wondering, like, do you feel when you're talking to congregants that well, I guess I have two questions. First of all, do you feel like the question of, like, did it really happen and how did it really happen is a live question? And also, like, do you feel like people are being asked to make meaning of the story as opposed to just tell the story?
I think it's a live question for some people. Not always with the Christmas story. Sometimes whenever we talk about Adam and Eve, someone says, did that really happen?
Yeah.
Or and someone went, I don't know if it was a professor of mine, said the question is not did it happen, but it always happens.
Yeah.
Like, these stories are like archetypes for the way that human beings relate in the world to God. The question is not if there was a CNN camera there at the foundation of the universe, or at the birth of Jesus, or at the resurrection, would there be reel to show of this historical event? That isn't, people can answer that question in the Christian tradition different ways. That isn't the most important question. It's what is it about that, what does that signify? So you said, whether or not the Exodus was this historical event as sometimes presented, you still were able to identify that these are my people, and this story impacts my own personal ethics, how I relate to my neighbor. And I think it's the same with the Christian story, that Meister Eckhart, who I think from the 13th century, said, what good was it that Mary was the mother of God if we don't all bear God into the world in our own lives? And the point of Jesus' baptism is not so much, it claims his uniqueness in a certain way, but then we're all Christians are baptized. We all are given that light and called to shine before others and to give glory to God through our actions. So in a sense, the power of the story is not that we are only sort of remembering what happened to certain people a long time ago, but those are our people. This carries forward today. This is why I hate Christmas pageants. This is probably heretical to say, because those are all about pretending. Like, we're going to dress up as people from the past and pretend that we're Mary and Joseph and the shepherd. That isn't the point of the story. It's not about what happened a long, long time ago in a place far, far away. It's that God comes to us today in Lynn, Massachusetts, in who we are. It's not that those were special people and we're these poor ordinary folk who don't get to participate in the story. God comes to John and to whoever's watching. The story is about God constantly being born into our midst, not just revering these characters from the past. So I try to, when people ask questions about did it happen, I try to, not that I avoid the question, but to say that isn't the most important question. The question is, how is this happening and unfolding right now?
And I think that that's so important. I also agree in terms of the story of the Exodus or the story of Abraham being called. I was just reading a text from the rabbis where someone says, well, why is it that God called Abraham and said to him, Lech lecha, go forth? And the text says, God is always calling all of us, all the time, always saying, I choose you, go forth. Mm-hmm. But only Abraham was listening. And so all these things, it's like, how can we listen? And so part of it, I think, of how to take this time of year, this time that's so rich with the stories of our faith, the stories of our families, is not just what does the story say, but also what does the story mean? And also what does the story mean to us? And that last question of what does it mean to us? How do I see a parallel from that story in my own life that I might be able to take as a lesson or as inspiration or to help discern how I'm supposed to act or respond in my own life? That I think that's when we can really live the story and not just have it be a pretend show, not just a pageant, but an opportunity for us to live holy lives and for the myths to be an invitation for us in whatever way to invite God into our midst and to be as holy as possible.
Absolutely. If it's all just pretending and decorations, then what really is the point? Hopefully, especially the way that at least, it probably isn't true for Hanukkah, but Christmas has been so commercialized, and that we associate this time of year not with transcendence or holiness, but with consumerism and making, not so much preparing a place in our hearts or in our lives to receive God, but preparing all the other things that distract us and sap our energy. So by the time the actual day is there, we're exhausted and burnt out and crabby, and it doesn't accomplish that which it's supposed to. It doesn't create the holy space that it's meant to create. You know, in the Christian church, we have the season of Advent, the 4 Sundays leading up to Christmas. It tries to help us do that, but it's so easily we're torn away into all these other preparations and distractions that keep us from noticing that this story is taking place today.
Yeah.
God, yeah.
Well, one thing I want to invite our viewers to think about is whatever it is that you are doing, how can you use that as a way of being intentional in doing that preparation and focusing on that learning? So even if you are shopping at the mall or making your lists and checking them twice, that you can actually think about, who am I this year, and how do I want to be kind and giving and the kind of person that would welcome someone to their home. So we are out of time.
Oh my gosh, we're out of time.
Yeah, so time flies when you're having fun. I want to thank everyone for watching and wish you beautiful holidays and a time that is worth lots of stories and lots of making meaning.